The Ohio Humanities Council, along with the Tri-C Foundation and the Cleveland History Center, present Jefferson's America, Divided but One. Saturday, November 23rd, 2024.
I want to mention that this is the third president of the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson is perhaps, and I would say most of the presidents of American history have been controversial. He's one of those early founding fathers that is controversial, mainly due to his the fact that he had slaves, and he was not the first president to do that, nor the last. But at the same time, his views on the Enlightenment, his views on freedom of speech, his views on government, what is good government, the purpose of government, what is the value of education, what is the value of each and every one of you in this room. I mean, no one has the right to tell you what your value is, because your value is already stated, right? It's stated by what the founding fathers would declare the supreme being, or what many Christians would refer to as God, right? God grants you your rights as a human being. No one can take that away from you, simply because a higher being has granted that to you, not because I or Mr. Jefferson has given that to you, correct? So with that said, Mr. Jefferson was very aware of that. He was one of the most leading founding fathers when it came to freedom of religion, the idea that that you can have discourse and disagreement and yet still admire and value the person that you disagree with. It's really a beautiful thing. We can learn so much from these early founding fathers. So with that said, just another thing to mention, Mr. Jefferson was from Albemarle County in Virginia. He came all the way from Philadelphia, actually, Philadelphia Hall. He was doing some work with his fellow founding fathers before he came here, so we're very thankful that he was able to come from the past and enter into this present day. And so when he responds to your questions, he will be responding probably in a more historical sense. You know, he's not going to be talking about current day politics, though you're welcome to bring stuff like that up, but he's going to probably reference those questions more in his time. So you'll get more of that sort of historical feel. And again, no question is off the table. So welcome again to Jefferson's America, Divided but One. And we would like to welcome Mr. Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. How are you doing?
It's an honor to be here.
Yes, it is an honor to have you. We have a lot to cover today, and so I was just explaining to the audience that we will begin with questions from myself, but then we will stop and ask if anyone has questions as well. So it'll be kind of a back and forth.
Excellent. More of a colloquy than a speech. I prefer that.
Yes.
I was never comfortable giving speeches. I was actually bad at it. So this is much better. We're all seated, all comfortable, at our ease. I prefer that very much.
Yes, and that's true. You were not that good at speaking in public, but you were very good at writing. You were a man of the pen, a man of letters. So, you know, I could go into talking about just the way you wrote and how you wrote, but the first thing I want to do is kind of ease you into this discussion and talk to you a little, and ask you, what led you to go into the political realm? Because Mr. Jefferson, you are a philosopher, you're more of a reader and a thinker. What led you into politics?
Well, before I address that question, I say we agreed that I would bring a few sand timers of 1 minute, 2 minute, and 3 minute duration. I don't know if you mentioned that.
I did not.
Yeah,
I apologize.
This is not because I believe any of the questions that will come deserve short shrift, but rather I want to move things along to open to as many questions as possible. So inevitably, some of my answers will be insufficient. I will do my best, though. You get to be 281 years of age. It's difficult to keep track of time. That's really why I brought them.
This is true.
So this is why did I go into politics? I'll see if I can keep this one as the first question under 1 minute. Here, see if it's possible. John Adams couldn't even clear his throat in 1 minute. I was expected to go into politics because I was born wealthy and privileged in a privileged class in Virginia. This was just going to be something that would have happened then. I wouldn't call myself a philosopher. I rely on philosophers. I study them, but I was more practical. At my best, I was more practical as a politician, relying on philosophy, but departing from it when necessity and new developments required. I wasn't expected to go into politics as much as I did, but I got a bit carried away. My education at William and Mary put me at the forefront of listening in. It's in 1765, for instance, in the Stamp Act crisis. These kind of footnotes are why I need a timer. Patrick Henry giving a very famous speech about that. I was just a law student. I couldn't even enter the assembly chamber, but I listened to the door. I was able to listen to applied politics in a crisis, take classes 1 mile away in the Wren building, then study law in George Wyth's offices a half a mile away, and visit with the governor of the state in the middle of that mile. This mixture of politics inspired me to become more curious about participating. But I see I'm out of my time there, so perhaps there'll be more on that later. But
okay. So, Mr. Jefferson, you worked with the Virginia government. In fact, you were governor of Virginia during the Revolution, if I'm not mistaken. And during the American Revolution, it came to your country, your hometown, your country of Virginia. Back then, they called their states countries. You know, so they came to your country of Virginia, and the British came and invaded. And I wanted to ask you something because I thought about this as I was researching about you. You could have freed your slaves and used them in the battle against the British. You know, Virginia was a huge slaveholding region. So why didn't you do that during the invasion of Virginia? Why? That was an opportunity where you could have freed them. They could have served in armies to fight the British. So why not do that?
I will keep this answer brief as well, because I think there are some more questions on the general subject. So I'll keep this one to 1 minute as well. Specifically during the invasion of Virginia by British as well as American forces, Benedict Arnold led a raid that ultimately came to my front door, quite literally. It was not a practicality for those who were of African descent, those who were enslaved, to join ranks with my fellow Virginians, for instance, because Virginians wouldn't have accepted it. General Washington at that point still wasn't at a point where he could even bring people who were even free black people who wanted to join into the military. Eventually it did happen during the Revolution. As governor, I was not dictated, nor did I want to take on dictatorial powers, which probably would have been convenient, but ultimately probably a bad idea. That was my opinion. The British did, Cornwallis did free, you might call it, some of my slaves, but they ended up not being treated well in the British encampments. Many of them died from smallpox, ill treatment. They just wanted to do damage to us by freeing the slaves. They didn't care about the people that they were actually freeing. So I didn't see it as a practical reality to be able to do so by the will of the people, nor by the financial resources I or the state had.
I see. Okay, and another kind of follow-up to that, I want to ask you, well, when you wrote your notes on the state of Virginia, okay, you made what we would term today racist. Back then, you would have referred to the term bigoted. Objections to African Americans as having an equal intellect with whites. You know, this argument that certain groups of people genetically do not have the same intellectual capabilities, let's say, than other groups. And you stated that African Americans were good imitators, but could not create anything uniquely theirs, except you mentioned dance and music. Benjamin Banneker, however, and he's featured here on this slide, Benjamin Banneker was a scientist. He was also an almanac author, argued against that. And he wrote to you directly in a letter, basically saying that what you said about African Americans in the notes of the state of Virginia was wrong, that there was no proof of any of that, and basically that he had the luxury of being free, and that most of his fellow brothers and sisters did not have that luxury. And so because they were enslaved, they did not have that intellectual capability that, let's say, he had because he was not enslaved. And you responded to him and said, I advance it therefore as suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. So you said it was under suspicion. So you didn't know for sure, you said in response to him, but you were making this theory and this claim. You thought one thing publicly, but yet you respond to Mr. Banneker something very different privately. And so I want to ask you, Would we label this hypocrisy, Mr. Jefferson?
I will choose a 2-minute timer for this, and we'll see how I do, because this is a complicated issue. Ultimately, it is your business whether or not you label any of my behavior hypocrisy. You are no more or less patriotic if you do so, because I believe the earth belongs to the living, not the dead. And so does the United States of America. That's part of what all men are created equal means. It's your job to judge me and label my mistakes as mistakes and my successes as successes, and then do with them what a people should do when they study the past. Moving backward through the subject matter, though, the discussion of the human race and different, in a botanical and biological sense, was international, at least throughout Europe, the Western world. Different races of humans then, so those who were from the eastern part of Asia, those who were from Africa, those from South America, those from Europe, etc. I was taking part in this Notes on the State of Virginia, the only formal book I ever wrote, in these passages and others on other subjects, in then my best efforts at taking part in a scientific discussion. One of the questions that was being asked by botanists and scientists around Europe and America was, are every race of human the same species? You may label this in a way very differently than we did, but the very concept of categorizing in a Linnaean system different kinds of plants and animals and humans was something we were very actively attempting to do. Looking then at the possibility of different capabilities based upon race and background. I say I'm even coming close to the two minutes and barely coming into this.
I'll turn it over.
Just reclaim my sand. I'm reclaiming my sand. Looking at this question then in as rational a capacity as possible was what I was trying to do, while simultaneously, and in the same book, there's Notes on the State of Virginia and another section talking about the issue of slavery specifically, I was also acknowledging that it was impossible, essentially, for me, a slave owner from birth, to study this subject of the differences, the potential differences between the races of humans in a way that was completely removed from any bias, bigotry, etc. One of the other things I wrote in the same book was that the relationship between master and slave is one of absolute despotism. It's absolute tyranny on the one side and subjection on the other. And I wrote about how the child of a slave owner, who then is a slave owner himself, watches the parent exercise in their wrath the worst aspects of human behavior and emotions, and then the child, as I put it, takes on the lineaments of wrath. So we observe those around us and we take on, as if clothing, on our minds. This is based on John Locke's ideas, the way the human mind works. And it is impossible, therefore, for the children not to take on the clothing of the mind, being it could be bigotry or prejudice, etc., and be completely unbiased in such opinions. I later went on to say that I think it would be impossible for the blacks and whites to live together in peace because of the bigotry on the one side, which you give another name, and because of the memories of the injuries and the anger and justified anger on the other side. It would end up in a war between the two races. Mm-hmm. I was then in this book, in these statements, trying to articulate something within this tension of, on the one side, acknowledging my limitations and such bigotry as may be part of those lineaments of wrath that I had taken on the other side, attempting to utilize science the best that I could use in an age of, just toward the age of enlightenment, to find a way out of that while admitting my failures. And my articulation of it is, of course, flawed.
Okay, so to put it in a nutshell, you argue that because you were thinking more in a scientific way and applying what you knew at the time, which today is considered pseudoscience, because you cannot prove the intellectual capacity of a human being based on race. You can certainly learn differences of races based on genetics, but to argue that intellectual inferiority belongs to one group than another, you cannot prove that, Mr. Jefferson. But that's I'm speaking from the 21st century.
I'm very open to this concept that
yes.
It's not, and to not prove it
yes.
means that you must then surrender to what can be proved.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
So
and Mr. Banneker
along
is
those lines,
proof
yes.
Unto himself, Mr. Banneker would be proof of that.
He is an example of proof, as I acknowledge, but part of what I acknowledged was almost all I saw were people who were enslaved. They were not literate. If there's one, it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read. There's one thing that a slave owner or any tyrant fears more than an armed slave, an educated slave. If you are uneducated but armed, a tyrant, a charismatic demagogue, can tell you to point your weapon in any direction they want, and you will go along with it in your ignorance. But if you're educated, you are truly dangerous. So I observed people who, by the system, this system related to the feudal system that we were related to, were, by definition, had to be uneducated, engaging in certain behaviors that would then follow suit in uneducated behavior. But also, they only show, I don't know what they showed me. What of various qualities that I observed, what emotions that they would show me of happiness, of loyalty, of passion, of dedication, of even if they were literate, would they show me that? When I knew it was illegal for them to be, if some of them were learning how to read secretly, they weren't going to show me that. So it was a situation impossible for me to be, if not unbiased, that was also impossible, but to have the information a true scientist needs at hand. And I was acknowledging that, attempting to, in some of the ways I also acknowledged that Benjamin Banneker was standing proof against my theory, but he was only one example, and data is not the plural of anecdote. You need to systematically collect the information. Benjamin Banneker then is an anecdote. If you collect more data, you can certainly disprove me, and I hope you do.
Yes, yes. Not to focus solely on this topic, but I do want to expand a little bit more, because you did a lot during your lifetime to attempt to end the importation of slaves. You attempted this in your first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was not accepted by, I believe, the delegates from North Carolina or Virginia. You attempted it in your the Constitution of Virginia, when you tried to put it into the Constitution and Virginia wouldn't accept it. You attempted it in the Summary View as well in 1774. And so it seems like you were dedicated on ending the importation of slavery. You also saw it as a bad institution. You did believe, it seems, that it could be a very negative and, evil, I guess you could use that word, institution.
It is an evil, yes.
Yes, an evil, or what the founders called a necessary evil back then, right?
I would quibble with necessary, but please keep going, yes.
Well, this is what you wrote in your notes on the state of Virginia. I think this is interesting. You said, the whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, from the master, and degrading submission on the other, for the part of the slave. With the morals of the people, when slavery exists, their industry is also destroyed. For in a warm climate, no man will labor for himself, who can have another labor for him. Basically arguing that men in the South would rather just sit back and sip their tea all day and have their slaves do the work for them.
Well, they were sipping something stronger than tea, but
okay,
yes.
Okay. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure, again, these are your words, when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. And then lastly, just quoting what you said, I think a change already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution, you're referring to the American Revolution, the spirit of the master is abating. It's going away. That of the slave is rising from the dust. His condition mollifying, the way I hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for total emancipation. Based on your words, you are prophesying the need to end slavery. But you didn't do it in your lifetime, Mr. Jefferson. And why didn't you do it in your lifetime?
Each one of Professor Asili's questions could be an entire course that she would teach aptly. I will try to keep addressing it within, and this one we'll see. We'll see how 3 minutes works on this one. Well, first of all, going backward through the question and the statement, when it comes to slavery, I failed. And my generation failed. We succeeded in some things. I succeeded in some things. Some of those successes are why I've been invited here today. But I believe a man who refuses to acknowledge his failures is not worth listening to when he talks about his successes. You can't believe his successes if when you ask him about a failure, he blames other people and makes excuses. I failed. Why did I fail? It wasn't because it was necessary. It's because I couldn't figure a way economically to extricate myself from depending on a system of labor that was based in slavery. And by the end of my life, I was so in debt that all my slaves were mortgaged to my creditors. And I was in too much debt, I couldn't free them. This is a failure on my part. I cannot say that I was unremitting in my efforts to question the institution of slavery or the economic system that was based on that labor force. I started out much stronger, and midway through my life, I stopped. I started out with a number of attempts that Professor Asili was articulated in one way or another. I came closer than others in some. When I returned from 5 years in France, I returned to the new United States under the Constitution. After that point, I made no public efforts to end slavery, nor did President Washington, nor did John Adams, who never owned a slave a day in his life, nor did Abigail Adams, et cetera, not because John Adams, who never owned a slave, he did not speak out against it either as president. Mm-hmm. We depended on it. This doesn't make it right. But by the 1790s, what I realized as Secretary of State, further as Vice President than as President, was that just to establish a rudimentary democracy in the modern world, for the first time in 2 millennia on such a wide geographical scope, we had our hands full with that much. Other questions about living up to the promises, for instance, in the Declaration of Independence, were too much for us to handle at that time. Now, as far as whether or not the spirit of the master is abating, I was, as Secretary of State, I was in charge of patents, and I got to know Eli Whitney. And when I saw his cotton engine, I thought that that was going to make slavery obsolete. You can tell me better than I can tell you whether or not I was right about that and how that speaks to my idea that slavery was naturally going to end in the United States. But I believed it was an inefficient engine, so not the slaves, but slavery itself, requiring more energy put into it than could be derived from it, and ultimately it was self-destructive. I think that is probably, I could talk longer on it, but I think I would start going into too much detail, and we've hit the 3 minutes.
Yes, and if anyone has a question, feel free to come to the, you can just.
Oh, we have,
oh,
well, this gentleman, and then we'll come to you, sir. And we might encourage people to utilize
yes,
the vocal augmentation device that you have devised that makes you able to be heard not only by us in the room, but we have surreptitious vocal augmentation devices upon our persons that will make your questions able to be heard by those who will watch in some way from other rooms through these camera obscura. I don't know. I set up my PR light earlier as well. But please, sir, with the first question.
Mr. President, thank you for being here. My question is, and it's something that dealt with approximately 60 or 70 years after your term, but would say in the institutes of slavery, is that something that should be a national policy? Or is that something that should be left to the individual states?
I believe it should be left to the states, but I believe questions like that ought to follow my basic idea of government, which is power should come from the people upward, not from the chief executive and the national government downward. And to force, part of it is practical, to force from a central power changes, even if they are beneficial and moral and needed, on a people who are not ready for them, will cause, as I said at the time, the machine to retrograde. And we will lose ground by trying to push the people to an improvement for which they are not ready, even if it is needed. So, on the one hand, power must flow from the people upward, and the states are the nearest governments to the people. In New England, they have smaller breakdowns, which I tried to establish in Virginia, but the states are the nearest overall to the people, voice of the people, and then it should move upward to the national government, ultimately, or else it will cause a rift rather than a solution.
Okay.
Not too far from here, there's a middle school named Monticello. In Ohio, we say it a little differently. About 80% of students at this middle school are Black children, but on your Monticello, they would have been enslaved and denied by law the opportunity of learning to read and write. Some say that the name comes from the Italian meaning of little mountain and not your estate. However, two things can be true. What are your thoughts on institutions of learning being named after you or your plantation, or forced labor camps, as I refer to them?
I first want to acknowledge our good citizens' linguistic expertise in noting that the Italian pronunciation of the word, two words put together, Monticello, is cello is a low violin, and cello means low, and mountain means low mountain. I named my low mountain after the Italian language I was studying for the architecture. I was just studying as the basis for much of my first version of the building and then later parts of it. And also acknowledging that language belongs to the people using it. So if in Ohio you say Monticello, well, that is yours, not mine. I hear in New York they pronounce it that way too. I'll blame that on Hamilton. They have a town named. How one of your era might categorize my home, I respect thoroughly. I changed in many ideas in my life. Some I held consistent. One of the things I held consistent was this notion: the earth belongs to the living, not the dead. Therefore, if the living generation decides they want to name their institutions or direct their country in a way that differs from my generation, what you're doing is exactly what my generation did. That's part of what all men are created equal means. All men are created equal doesn't mean everyone who lived in my era, who looked like me and dressed like me, talked like me, and then the rest of you, well, just try to figure out what we did and imitate that, including pronunciation and naming of places. It means the earth belongs to the living and the country belongs to the living, to you. But I hope this is not just a politician's answer, but addressing the heart of your question, my good citizen. I will add one technical term. I'm a lawyer, and this is a legal term, but bear with me, I beg you. Are there any lawyers here, by the way? You can admit it, you're safe here. No, none. Good for you. No lawyers here but me. A legal term. When I said the earth belongs to the living, not the dead, this is a letter to James Madison. I said the earth belongs in usufruct to the living. Now, usufruct, in addition to being a word you must pronounce very carefully in polite company, is a legal term coming from the roots of use and fructus, or fruit. In law, then, if you own something in usufruct, you own the use of it. For instance, if you own the tree in usufruct, you can enjoy the shade, you can enjoy the fruit, but you cannot utilize that resource in such a way that destroys it for the use of others or those who come after you and also own it in usufruct. If a walkway is on your property technically, but it is a public walkway, you own it in usufruct, it is your responsibility to help keep it clear, but you cannot block it, tether your horse on it to block passers-by, tear it apart and build an extension of your house on it. It is yours in usufruct. The earth is also the possession of the living generation in usufruct. It is therefore, if you want to change the name of that school, it's not my home. You change it whatever you want. I would say that those who are trying to say it's not named after my home, but after a little mountain in Italy, maybe trying a little bit too hard. It's probably named after my home. Let's be honest, we could do that, even though I'm a politician. But to argue against you and say, well, we must honor me, you must honor me by naming the school that way, ironically, would not be honoring me. The way to honor me, if you really want to do what I want you to do, treat the earth like it belongs to you. Treat the country like it belongs to you. Name it after the things you want to name it after. Make it look like you, act like you, talk like you. So if you want to rename the school, I would argue do so, even if it's named after my home. I'm not honored by statues and monuments. Heaven help us all if they destroy a perfectly good mountainside with my face. That's what empires do. That's what tyrants do. What I am honored by is if your public educational institution is adequately funded and resourced for the poorest of our citizens, so that we will not repeat the process of having an entire class of people either literally enslaved or enslaved by the shackles that are the requisite result of ignorance of the mind.
Mr. Jefferson, I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you directly. My question is actually more of a statement. Would you spend a few minutes talking about slavery from a historical point of view prior to the Revolutionary War, indeed even prior to your lifetime, because Britain, Great Britain, under the Georges, George First, Second, and Third, were the ones responsible for importing slaves from Jamaica, the Barbados, other parts of the world into what was then British-controlled North America. So slavery was imposed upon you and your generation as British colonists, and then following the revolution against the crown, slavery was a necessity because you were used to it as an economic engine. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the question. This one I will keep within 2 minutes in order to respect everyone's time and also the time. And he said a few minutes, so the gentleman must have been reading my writings because these are explanations I gave in my 1774, what became the Summary View of Rights of British America. That's the argument I made there, and I made in other places. Of all the Africans, they were not brought from Barbados or Jamaica. They were brought from Africa to the sugar plantations in the British and French West Indies, then, and also to the colonies, United States. Of all the Africans enslaved in this hemisphere, in the colonies, the 13 of the colonies in North America, we had about 6 to 10% in 1776. 20% were in the British West Indies, 20% in the French West Indies, and a good 50% in South America with the Boque in Brazil. Silver mines in Andes, etc. Not Brazil there, of course, obviously. So we had a small percentage. However, I tried to make the argument that it was forced on us. That didn't hold out even among my contemporaries. We wanted it. We were used to it because it made us comfortable. And we failed to find a way to change our economic system around to not depend on it. But that is different than needing it. We had a necessity of functioning. We solved it with a certain attempt at a solution. The necessity of functioning, having an economy that was operating, participating in a worldwide economy that was based on slavery was there. Those are necessities. But the means by which we participated, a labor force based in slavery, that was not necessary. It was only expedient. Our failure was, on a cultural level, and me personally, was on not being able to successfully make the distinction and find a practical solution. I hope that addresses the subject, both of the context, but also the subject matter you brought forward.
Okay, those were great questions.
Can I interrupt?
Oh, yes.
I have, Mr. President, you've confused me on the issue of the source of human rights and how they are dispersed. And I think this is going to be a reductive analogy, but I believe that you were part of a group that rebelled against Britain because, as you said, when we became free and all men were created equal, they looked like you, and that you rebelled against Britain because Britons felt that you did not look enough like them or did not share enough in their capacity. So when you talk about allowing states to decide what rights are actually from God,
I see where you're going.
how can a person who was once enslaved or a woman have rights in one state that are derived from God and not in another state?
You sound like John Marshall.
Thank you.
You may have been reading his opinions. And these are arguments John Marshall made then during my presidency, and especially in opinions after my presidency in the second decade of the 19th century regarding various Supreme Court cases. And John Marshall and I don't get along. We're cousins, distant cousins, not distant enough. But you also sound like Alexander Hamilton, who made the same arguments in his contributions to the Federalist Papers, and John Marshall considered Alexander Hamilton his hero and quoted him in some of his opinions. Part of their arguments against me is predicated on believing that I take the state governments as being the sovereigns as opposed to the national government. I believe the people are the sovereign and that the state governments are the nearest tool they have for putting into action their understanding of their rights. I hope that's not just rhetoric. I hope that that comes across as my not dodging your question, but of trying to get to the core of it. That if a people are to come, to travel from a people meaning a collective entity operating within one organizational structure, are to make a traverse from a functioning economy and mindset that assumes slavery is necessary, as some even now are calling it, that, as I assume, women ought not vote or hold public office, to a place where those things are believed to be not true, and that the operational structures of government acknowledge that new idea and incorporate it. I believe that trying to force it from the top down will do more damage than good, because you will cause bitterness and anger among those who, whether or not they are morally right, or those who are educated agree with them, they believe it to their core. And if they feel they are being forced by a large government against something that some people actually morally believe slavery was right. I didn't, but some did. They will rebel against it. And that's what will cause the retrograded machinery. Ultimately, some of the improvements that you mentioned, one that I didn't even see as being possible, women holding perhaps public office, that kind of a thing, I think there's no means of attaining them but the slow and hard way of starting on a local level. If the local government and the local opinions are the problem, then that is where the conversation and the solution must start. Now, if Alexander Hamilton were here, he would have already cut me off.
Yes, he would have. He would have. And you know, I want to get to this gentleman's question, and then I would like to ask more questions so that we can get more people asking
I
questions.
would just like a follow-up.
Yeah.
Wouldn't King George have said that you and the founders were an angry group who forced something?
Yes, and he used a lot of cannons and firelocks to try to defend that opinion. We were lucky, very lucky, that he was distracted by other theaters of war throughout the world increasingly as it went on, that we had the help of the French Navy. The French and the French military, they weren't fighting for the liberty of all people. They were a monarchy, and they enslaved 20% of the extant slaves in the world in the West Indies, just not in France proper, so they could say they didn't, etc. They didn't have slaves. But their enemy was our common enemy too. We were lucky in the military, and there was valor as well, but lucky in the military conquest that defended our argument. Ultimately, and maybe we'll get to more of this later, I believe that there's a core, though, to the argument of a revolution, as articulated in the Declaration of Independence, that addresses the tension between our ideals and what I think you are articulating, that we had our ideals and our stated beliefs in what human nature was, and there was a gulf between that and how we treated people and how our laws applied to them. And I think that as we come in this conversation, I will be able to come back to that addresses the overall subject. But in short, yes, King George III made the same argument against us and said we were just outliers in small colonies, not being grateful. Our taxes were lower than anybody on the island of England. Yes.
Thank you for that.
Hello, sir. How are you? I was wondering what your arguments back in the day were, because it seems like you wanted the nation to turn into a bunch of gentlemen farmers. And
so I've been accused.
Yeah, and then it had, even at that back in the day, it had been evident that we were going to become a building society and more of an industrial revolution. And
Keldermarsh.
Okay, and I was just and wanted to hear some of your arguments if you might have posed back then, as far as how you would have foresaw us becoming those educated farmers of an entire nation instead of becoming more of an industrial revolutionized country.
First of all, the gentleman speaks with erudition and articulates things succinctly and in a way that is fair-minded, and I commend you for that, good citizen. Having said that, I must acknowledge, as a previous good citizen mentioned, a perhaps necessary reductivism in the articulation of my stance. I understand you must present elements of history on different levels to different levels of education. So perhaps in education of your adolescence, you may categorize me as wanting gentlemen farmers, Alexander Hamilton wanting an industrial and commercial society. And for someone who is 15 years old, except for the exceptional ones, like ones who give up their Saturday mornings to come to such a conversation, you'll be lucky if you can even get them to understand that much. So that much reductivism, if you are teaching students of that age, perhaps, I respect that. However, it's oversimplified, just as I have been oversimplified recently in my arguments in a traveling musical theatrical production of Alexander Hamilton's life, where we chant in rhythmic metered rhyme to each other, and we apparently have a debate in this metered rhyme. My arguments are very reduced to oversimplicities in that. But I understand why it has to be done, especially for that purpose. Now, I started out, especially my notes in the state of Virginia, for instance, wishing that all of our factories should be and workshops should be in Europe. While I had Mulberry Row, which, by the way, I constructed the landscape of Monticello, not visible from the house of Monticello, where the workshops and small factories with the people who were enslaved working for the small town that was the main plantation of Monticello were just over the ridge from my home. John Adams, coming from New England, where they did not have an enslaved working class, had a very different opinion because he saw the people who were doing the work in a very different circumstance of life. Now, I started out wanting to have, Cicero is my hero. I wanted us all to be Ciceros. And if we were, there would be very little to the survival of our republic. Ultimately, I made these changes later on and a little too late for Alexander Hamilton to gloat. More's the pity. He did die too young. He did. I did not gloat over his death. I did not feel happiness over his early death. Dueling doesn't make anyone brave or hero. Dueling only makes widows and orphans. I came closer to Alexander Hamilton away from this wanting everyone to be Cicero. Or as George Washington would say, wanting everyone to be Cincinnatus, the gentleman farmer. Especially, and during the War of 1812, we didn't call it that at the time, but it got labeled that. During the War of 1812, I eventually saw there were some good things about, for instance, I tried to justify my embargo, cutting off all trade, because it increased local manufactures and decreased our reliance on imported luxuries, that kind of a thing. I ultimately said, instead of wanting all of our workshops and factories to be in Europe, I came closer to Alexander Hamilton and saying, well, first of all, we can use his bank to pay down the debt. Then once we don't have a debt, we don't need his bank. So you've done that, right? Got rid of the debt. I reduced the debt by 33% in my presidency with the Louisiana Purchase. So you may need to talk to Albert Gallatin, my Secretary of the Treasury, how he did it. I did ultimately say, well, we should have commerce be the handmaiden of agriculture. What do I mean by that? To come to a close on this, is that we have a resource in farmable land that Europe only could dream of. We shouldn't try to compete with them with the resources they have that we don't. But one person, one family with half an acre can support themselves. Half an acre and a firelock can support themselves. And with a full acre has plenty of extra to spare. With that much, we could be the granary of all Europe and use trade warfare with giving not weaponry, but giving favorable trade deals with nations who then protect our shipping and give us favorable deals to enter into world markets as a new nation with a new power of our agriculture, but acknowledging we need home manufacturers as well. So I changed over the years on that, still wanting manufacture and industry to be the handmaidens of agriculture, though.
Thank you yes, thank you. That was an excellent question, because the idea of, you were so fond of agriculture, so fond of your home in Virginia, and it's so interesting when we read your letters, Mr. Jefferson, you really challenged the Federalists on many grounds and on many cases, particularly when it came to the National Bank, but also when it came to the Alien and Sedition Acts. One particular moment in American history, which some of us forget, is during the presidency of John Adams. And during that
John
time—
Adams hopes you never forget that. He was the second president,
Yeah. Well, and you were the vice president, which is interesting. Back then it was the way that the president was considered was the person who had the most votes became president.
Well, the most votes in the Electoral College. We didn't pay much attention to the popular vote at the time.
Okay. And then you were vice president. So the second most
Second most
amount of
Electoral
votes
College votes, you
in the electoral
became vice president.
Yes.
Because we didn't expect parties political parties to become
Yes.
an entity. We can't think of everything.
At that time, the French Revolution was very violent. You had supported the French Revolution from its infancy, even helping the Marquis de Lafayette write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. That's pretty amazing that our Declaration of Independence is the prototype for the French Declaration, and that's because of you, Mr. Jefferson, and the Marquis. But I want to ask you, another revolution also transpired in Haiti, where many French immigrants from the island entered the United States. And we were in a quasi-war, which means we were in a war on the seas with France. This really frightened the Federalists. They wanted to change the naturalization law from 5 years to 14 years residence in the United States. And they
succeeded, yes.
Yes, they did. They did do that. And then they also made it a crime to print, utter, or publish any scandalous or malicious writings about the president or about
They
the
listed a
Federalists.
few. They said about the president or senators. They went through a list. You know who they skipped? The vice president. It was perfectly legal to say anything you wanted about it. It was me.
Well, which leads the question then, Mr. Jefferson. What was your reaction to the Alien and Sedition laws? And do you think Mr. President Adams was acting in fairness to secure the safety of the American people?
You've seen why I need these. I'll go as efficiently as I possibly can. I believe that freedom of speech, there were sedition laws, libel laws on state books already. The First Amendment prohibited any such laws being ratified by the national government. If we wanted to ratify them by the national government, we have to pass an amendment. They were explicitly prevented. But they existed in the states and should be in the states on a local level. Importation of such citizens or non-citizens, such persons, as each state wished to import for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution, was stipulated in the Constitution. I believe, therefore, the alien laws directly conflicted with that part of the Constitution, and the sedition law directly conflicted with the First Amendment in that regard. We needed amendments to change it. I believe Mr. Adams, in good faith, was attempting to protect the United States, but I think he got a little carried away in 1798. He's not used to being popular. Didn't know what to do with it. That's what you'll get when you're always honest, like John Adams is. You're not as popular. Honest all the time, whether you like it or not. He'll tell you what he thinks of you. So I wrote drafts for resolutions that were eventually adapted and presented to the Kentucky legislature that suggested, in short, with these Kentucky resolutions, I believe our national government is not a three-branch government with the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. I believe our national government is a four-branch government: executive, legislative, judicial, and states. The states collectively being a fourth branch in that balance of government. But I was trying to open a conversation. How could we make this balance? Suggesting the legislature can nullify laws in their own way. The executive can veto laws, a limited nullification. John Marshall would say the judiciary can nullify laws. Well, then the state should have some limited balance in nullification of laws as well. No one responded, no one picked it up. But that was my suggestion to try to address when it is believed the national government oversteps its constitutional balance. It was a suggested solution, is all I can say.
Okay, now I want to sort of juxtapose to the point of you being president. Once you become president in what was termed the Revolution of 1800, now this was a peaceful revolution, peaceful transference of power from the presidency of John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. You stated in your inaugural address this is very interesting. This is what you said: "But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left to combat it." So basically you're saying, if someone wants to change the kind of government we have, let them have the freedom to speak their mind about that and share their thoughts about what it is they want to do. Let those opinions be freely shared and tolerated where reason is left to combat it, meaning that people's reason would challenge that. Do you think it's possible to live in an environment where you believe something very, very strongly, and yet someone else disagrees vehemently with you, and let's say one of those people get in power? How are we to handle, let's say, a hypothetical circumstance
Well, I
like
mean,
that?
of course, it was happening in our day. In 1798, due to these conflicts you were talking about, I wrote that men that had known each other and been familiar and intimate all their lives would cross the street when they saw each other coming so they wouldn't have to touch their hats to each other because of politics. How to address this subject? Because it is part of the tension of any government by the people. I think one way to address it is to dispel what I think might be categorized as a fairy tale. What is the fairy tale? That there are two sides to every argument. I think if you accept that, you are believing in an oversimplification that does damage to a conversation. Because I believe in any reasonable discussion, there are three sides, if you break it down to its most basic elements. Three sides to every discussion. Two sides that fundamentally disagree in good faith, and then one side that is composed of those who are in bad faith. For the in good faith disputants to productively engage in a conversation, be that personally or on a national and organized level structurally, they must acknowledge what it is to be in good faith, and therefore be free to label those who are in bad faith. In a political experiment, a scientific political experiment such as the United States, good faith is defined by utilizing and being open to demonstrable, recordable evidence, to the results of experimentation, to engaging in experimentation. Good faith involves acknowledging that data is not the plural of anecdote. Good faith is in part defined by the premise that we know that science is sometimes wrong. It has been wrong. And how do we know it? Because of science. Science is what showed us it was wrong before by continuing with experimentation and gathering of data and testing and finding a better solution and conclusion. So to argue we cannot listen to those scientific conclusions or experiments or theories because science is wrong sometimes is in bad faith because it's cutting off the second half of the scientific premise, which is that yes, and science is looking for all the ways in which it's wrong so it can improve on it. The ones who are not looking for the ways in which they are wrong, they're the ones in bad faith. So how do you overcome this conundrum? I think we did it in 1800 with our circumstance, but in short, what it comes down to is that you must seek out the people with whom you disagree fundamentally regarding politics, political theory, human nature, but who are in good faith, and engage with them in order to stop the ones who are in bad faith. Who are ones that are in bad faith historically? We've seen this in republics historically. I'm going to categorize this a different way. I didn't use a timer in this one intentionally because this is probably the most important part of our conversation, I think. They are, according to the greatest authorities of my generation that we used, there are three basic forms of human government. The two greatest authorities, Cicero from the 1st century BC in Rome, and Montesquieu, middle of the 18th century in France. Montesquieu was quoted more than any other political philosopher by the framers of the Constitution. And then Cicero, very close to him. But they were separated by 2 millennia. They both categorized the three basic forms of government the same way. They said that there are, in short, it's government by the one, by the few, or by the many. They both said monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy. But democracy means government by the many. So we're a democracy, even though if you compare us to the Athenian democracy, we're not the same. That's a different debate over democracy. I mean, governed by the one, governed by the few, governed by the many. We are therefore a democracy according to Montesquieu and according to Cicero. They each said then, over 2 millennia apart, that for each form of government, there's one quality that is necessary, one spring, like in a machine, a spring, that is necessary for those forms of government to work, without which each one will fail, respectively. In a monarchy, what is the one spring necessary for that machine to work? Fear. You need fear for a monarchy, a despotism, a tyranny to work. For an aristocracy, an oligarchy, however you want to refer to government by the few, what do you need? Honor. That sense of honor that those who are privileged and in power are serving those in less power. Noblesse oblige, you would say in French. In a democracy, what is the one spring over 2,000 years the authorities we relied on said was necessary for a democracy to work? Virtue. Not virtue as who you pray to or don't, or whether or not you speak polite language all the time, but in the Roman sense, in the Latin root of the word, vir, they didn't have a U, so, or a W either, so vir is, we would pronounce it if you study Latin, vir. So the base of being a man, but not men who are showing off their strength and wrestling and biting each other's thumbs off in a wrestling match or anything like that, so you can ride a horse the best. But in this 2,000-year-old concept of what a man's duty was, a duty to the public. And a wish to serve others, like Cicero, like Cincinnatus. Without that virtue in that sense, the wish to serve others, what you end up with are these examples, the failure of the Athenian democracy based on their bringing Cleon of Athens to power, who only cared about himself and played on the fears and the anger and the passions of the people, to cause them to make foolish decisions in the Peloponnesian War, so they lost the war for themselves. They should have beaten the Spartans. They had the navy and they had the budget for it. The Romans brought Julius Caesar in, who only cared for power for himself and believed he was above the law. They welcomed him in and literally voted him to be a god in the Senate. And he was the death of the Republic. The French Republic, by the time Napoleon rose to power, people were desperate because of the carnage and violence and instability that you referred to, Professor Asili. They were desperate for someone strong to come in and bring stability at all costs. They welcomed Napoleon like a hero, and that was the end of the French Republic. In each case, these were not men of virtue, no matter what private arguments you might make about their morality, because they cared about their own power, serving themselves, not about the people and not about posterity. We were able to stop that with Aaron Burr almost gaining power in the constitutional crisis of 1800, by Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and myself in our own ways, though we disagreed fundamentally, working with each other. John Adams, a friend of mine, but I disagree with him strongly. Alexander Hamilton, we were never going to be friends. But we worked together because we realized in that moment that if you're going to stop the Cleons of Athens, the Julius Caesars, the Napoleon Bonapartes, the Aaron Burrs, you're not going to do it by the moment someone who disagrees with you gaining power, you are now angry and you hate them and everybody who voted for them just because they disagree. And so you get as many people who agree with you as possible. Try to gang up on them the next time. That one book that I wrote that we mentioned, I said that 175 despots are no better than one despot. So pure democracy of just gang warfare, mob rule, is not better than any of the other kinds of government. It is not in good faith. So how do you stop them then? Because if you just look for that slightly larger group of people who vote and think like you and agree with you all the time, maybe even dress the same as you, to show that they agree with you, all you're going to do is split America in half like we did in 1819 with what they called a compromise, and it wasn't. And then you invite in the Cleons of Athens and the Caesars and the Napoleons and the Aaron Burrs. So how do you stop them? You find in your life the Alexander Hamiltons and the John Adamses. John Adamses in your life, your friends and your family with whom you fundamentally disagree. I mean, you vote differently. You disagree on human nature. But you know if you're honest with yourself, they are in good faith. If you present evidence, they will listen. If they present evidence, you will listen. You will look for the experimentation, the evidence of science, acknowledging it is wrong, and that reason why we know it is wrong is because science shows us that, and you will move with political science as well as other kinds, and open to the possibility you might be wrong. Then there are the Alexander Hamiltons in your life, the ones you're never going to be friends with. You won't like them. Maybe they're obnoxious. Maybe like Alexander Hamilton, they always think they're the smartest person in the room. Or worse, maybe like Alexander Hamilton, they're often right. But if you're honest with yourself, you know that they're in good faith too. And you must find them as obnoxious as they are. as Alexander Hamilton convinced his Federalists to cast ballots for me in that crisis, or to cast blank ballots because they couldn't bring themselves to write my name, but at least to allow their states to vote for me in that crisis in the House of Representatives. Or John Adams, who went home willingly and did not try to grasp power in that crisis. You must find those people in good faith to stop the ones in bad faith. And if you cannot find them, the ones who vote differently than you, who fundamentally disagree with you about politics and are in good faith, you should look inward. Because they were there in my day and they are always there. But don't let that cause you to fall for the fairy tale that just because someone votes differently or has a different opinion, that they are in good faith. And you must beware of the ones in bad faith. Yes, they are free to speak, but it doesn't mean you invite them here to a conversation. If I was in bad faith, I would show it by insulting you, arguing, cutting you off, when people ask me questions that make me not look so heroic, let's face it. I would have been offended. I would have probably said something about how rude you were. I probably would have criticized you and made excuses. Instead, I tried to show I'm in good faith by admitting my failures. So I invite you to disagree with me on those things and label me as a failure on those things. But I hope what Professor Asili and I are showing you today is another way of approaching it, how we stopped our republic from falling in 1800. The good faith disagreements are the only way to stop the in bad faith contributors to that conversation.
Yes, that I think is really a lesson we can absolutely learn from. Absolutely. And yes, and if I can just add to what you just said, Mr. Jefferson, because what you brought up is so crucial, and this idea that we have to really look inward, think about, where is our conscience in all of this, right? Are we really thinking about what's in the best interest of the people? Or are we thinking about what we ourselves think is the best interest of ourselves, And I think it's pretty natural for us to think about ourselves. I think that comes very naturally for most humans, but to be thinking about what's in the best interest of your neighbor, the best interest of the community, that's something really important. And we may not see eye to eye, but it's important to have these conversations. Now, I want to ask you one more question, and then I want to end this by opening it up to the audience one last time for any question you have. And it's on religion. I wanted to talk because I think this is a good sort of segue when you talk about virtue, the idea that virtue is what helps us become better humans. It's what allows us to think of others, put the public interest ahead of our own private interest. We can question whether or not today in the 21st century, far after you, Mr. Jefferson, if most people are really living in accordance with virtue or raising their children with virtue. That's something we can debate and talk about, and I'm sure you did in your day as well. But on the subject of religion, you had a few sort of, I'm not sure where you lie on religion, and so I want to get a little bit.
I hope I never lie on religion.
Well, I mean, I meant, yeah, pun on words. I know it was low-hanging fruit, but that was funny. You said, this is what you said in your notes on the state of Virginia, and then I will reference a letter to John Adams. You said in your notes, our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. So whatever we've given our government, the authority over us, that's what we've handed to them. The rights of conscience, we never submitted. So we never submitted our conscience to the government, right? That's for us to control. We could not submit. We are answerable for them to our God. So you refer to God, capital G. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So you're basically arguing that, again, it doesn't matter whether one believes in God or not, as long as they're just, doing what's lawful or what's right in accordance to the law. Okay, and then you write to John Adams, this is in 1817, so much later after the notes, you say this: if the sublime doctrines of philanthropism, that's philanthropy, and deism, which is a religious idea, believing in one God, taught us by Jesus of Nazareth, in which all agree, constitute true religion, then without it, this would be, as you, referring to John Adams, again say, something not fit to be named even indeed a hell. So you were agreeing here with John Adams that to not agree with the precepts of Jesus of Nazareth would be to be living in a hell. So I'm just I'm just not sure where you lie, Mr. Jefferson, on religion. Can you
I'm
clarify?
confusing when it comes to religion. I changed over my lifetime.
Yeah.
I had to be Anglican when I was born. It was the law. Had to. I changed that. I put it in my epitaph. Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. We disestablished any churches. By the way, I should mention, Madam, your question regarding what rights are not to be subjected even to state governments, I would turn anyone, you write your laws so long in these days. One of my 3 proudest achievements was this law, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. You can read it out loud in 10 minutes, not even going fast. But in that, I articulate limits that a state government may not pass by when it comes to limiting or dictating conscience. But I also articulate, and I articulate in other letters as well, that there are limits that any government of what they can do rightfully as far as dictating basic human rights, which to you might sound like a modern term. We use the term human rights in my day as well. We also use terms like rights of man, but we meant human rights. So your question touched on human rights, and if I believe that the state governments ought to have more say than the federal government, do the state governments then have the right to take away basic human rights? If you look at my Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, I'm making an argument, no. State governments don't have. If they are discovered to be basic human rights, state governments don't have that right either. But regarding my own take on religion, as time went on, I studied the Gospels of the 4 evangelists very closely over the years in different languages. You have projectiles, and so I'm always concerned when I bring up this subject. I came to believe that I called him Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus Christ. Christ is not a surname, it is a title. I was born taught it was a title. I eventually, through my own reflection and study, decided I did not believe that he was divine any more than you or I. I went through I believed he was Jesus of Nazareth. I believed, and I wrote this in letters to Mr. Adams, only a few people, because if it's a bit scary for me to say this in front of you, a group of reasonable people, can imagine President of the United States saying something like this, how angry they would be with him. Even by the time I was president, I believed that the moral teachings of the human philosopher, Jesus of Nazareth, were the purest moral teachings ever propounded by a mortal man. I believe that the basic teachings as gathered in the incomparable Gospels of the 4 evangelists, when the mysteries and magic tricks were removed, were powerful without the need of any mysteries. And that the power of Jesus of Nazareth was that those who were not educated, who did not study Latin or Greek, who didn't have advanced degrees and read stacks of books or even the opportunity to do so, could understand every single moral concept that he talked about. And as he referenced Maimonides, the ancient Jewish philosopher and teacher, because of course Jesus was not Christian, he was Jewish. Christianity happened, right, you understand. When he wanted to summarize all of the law, he did it the same as Maimonides did by saying that you can summarize it in 2 ways, which is how I summarized it. And that is love God and love others, is the short way to say it. So in saying that I believe that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth were universal and the basis of civilization functioning and not becoming, as Hobbes would argue, a war of all against all in which life is nasty, brutish, and short, I'm not saying that we have some responsibility to believe in miracles or believe in a miraculous resurrection. In my version, I took his teachings in 1804 King James Bibles. Don't throw anything at me. I took a razor blade to each of them. I needed 2 because I needed quotes from the other side of the page. Just like you might from your favorite tomes and texts, cut and paste your favorite quotations. And I pasted them in another document. And then over the next decade and a half, I then took from the French, ancient Greek, and Latin languages and put the translations beside each other because the differences in none of them were in Aramaic, sadly. He spoke Aramaic. We have no direct writings of him or anyone of what he actually said in Aramaic, a totally different language family than Greek. 50 years later, the first time anything that he spoke written in Greek, a totally different language. So I was fascinated by these changes in language because I study all these languages, and I studied them privately and only told a few people like John Adams, Charles Thompson, Joseph Priestley, founder of what you would call Unitarianism, who had to leave his country in fear and come to America because of his unusual beliefs. I believe that then these basic tenets, as I cut and paste, were strong enough. I didn't include any miracles. There are references to him healing people, but doctors heal people. Well, not many in my day, but by your day, perhaps. People who are experienced in healing, it might not be miracles. I left out all of the miracles, and I ended it with his mortal death. I will not try to tell you what to believe or convince you one way or the other, though it's your freedom of speech to try to tell me to believe or convince me to believe otherwise. Mm-hmm. But I will say that perhaps you may want to, I've heard they published this book in your day. They call it the Jefferson Bible, which makes it sound like something it isn't. But just try it if you've been brought up within Christianity. And you may find, as I know some personal friends of mine were surprised, how powerful those teachings are, just reading them straight through like that, without the miracles and other stories. I would not say you change your belief, but perhaps you, like me, would believe that his teachings were strong enough even to those who don't believe. And coming down to it then, this idea that all men are created equal is based in the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson. I mentioned this earlier today in another conversation. All men are created equal doesn't mean, according to Francis Hutcheson's writings, and I was basing my writings on him in the Declaration, doesn't mean that we all have the same capacity to reason or look the same, have the same number of hours on earth, have the same talents, believe in the same things, any of that, wealth at birth, any of that. It means we're all born with a conscience. Humans are, as a species, defined by that. He called it benevolence, beginning in 1721 with his writings, did Francis Hutcheson. But he called it benevolence, but it means this universal love of humankind. And common sense, the term we used, was from Francis Hutcheson and the Scottish Enlightenment. It did not mean that, which is rudimentary in understanding how the world works, as you might use common sense. Common sense means a sense like touch, hearing, sight, taste, but those are external senses, as Hutcheson categorized their internal senses, and this sense of benevolence, of love for all mankind, even the ones who are obnoxious and who don't agree with you. It is summarized in the word conscience. And that is with us at birth, whether or not you are an atheist. I know atheists who are among the most moral people in the world. They do not rely on a doctrine or ecclesiastical law to stop them from killing and stealing and raping or doing anything they want because they don't want to do those things. Because they were born with consciences, because they're humans. And that is the summary, I believe, of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, the summary of Scottish Enlightenment thought, and the summary of what it means to say all men are created equal.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. And if I could just add real quick, you mentioned that, kind of doing away with the miracles of Jesus, you don't need those miracles. It makes sense, but I will say from a Christian perspective, they would say that's absolutely wrong.
And they have said to me.
Because miracles happen every day. The fact that you came back after 281 years is pretty amazing.
Well, my coming here is more complicated than that. It's due to physics beyond those of Isaac and Newton, technology that you developed, and a modern physicist. You have actually one of his remarkable devices that provided this service. Monsieur Delorean, his device is here in the museum. So I don't know.
Translated DeLorean, everyone. Translated
You pronounce
DeLorean.
it differently, just like Monticello. I understand.
Yes.
Different pronunciations. But I would not debate with someone over the presence of miracles because it is undebatable. Faith is belief in something for which there is no proof.
Correct.
If you have proof, it's not faith. It is science. I have been called a doubting Thomas, but I cannot argue against these miracles existing. I have just seen no proof. I'm open to it. Now, given the time span from my death to now and what has transpired, I won't tell you what's happened, what proof I may or may not have seen, but I certainly would not argue with you on your tenets of faith, my good citizen.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Okay, does anyone have any questions they want to ask? And again, feel free to just run up to this mic. So we have time for like one or two more questions. And then...
I feel it's very polite that you've even named your vocal augmentation device with a very human name. Call him Michael, that is.
Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Sally? And Were she and Martha really sisters? Mhm.
So what our good citizens brought forward, and this is another one. I was going to go back to the timers, but this one, I have an approach to it, but timing is not necessary for it, for I'm limited in my ability to address it. What our good citizens brought forward is the subject of one of the people who were enslaved by my family, specifically by my father-in-law, and then I legally inherited Sally Hemings and the entire Hemings family. Her real name, given name, was Sarah. Sally is a diminutive, you would call it a nickname, of Sarah Hemings. And the lady has asked about my relationship with Sally Hemings. This question is based, it became a question, though never brought to me directly, in my day, based upon rumors spread about me in the press after I was elected presidency. A disgruntled former employee of mine by the name of James T. Callenter tried to blackmail me into getting an appointment. I was president, we could appoint. I said the worst parts of being president were the appointments and disappointments to office. Because with every appointment, you create 1,000 jealousies and one ingrate. And James Callender tried to blackmail me. I didn't succumb to the blackmail. He wasn't qualified for the job, and so he printed these rumors in the papers. Here are what the rumors stated. That after my wife Martha passed away, she was very young, there was complications of childbirth. She was but 33 years of age. It was September 6th of 1782. I first left politics altogether, was convinced to join back into the fray again. Eventually in 1784, 2 years later, traveled to France to represent America. I thought it was going to be 1 year, turned into 5 years. While I was there, I had brought my oldest daughter with me, Martha. She was old enough for the ocean voyage. She'd been inoculated. But my two daughters who were still in Virginia, they were too young for it as of yet. Now, after a few years away, Martha, who was named after her mother, was growing up under my eyes and growing up to look much more like me than her mother, which is still a shock to see, for a father to see his little girl becoming a young lady. But Mary, who was now, by this point, by 1786, the only surviving of my daughters. Childhood is the most dangerous thing to endure in the 18th century. A toothache could cause death. A fever could cause death. Mary was beginning to become a young lady in my absence. Now, I sent for Mary to come and join me. Now, this was a few years past, and I was in France by this point for about 3 years. By this point, had been in France for 3 years. I was beginning to start life over again. I said now, by this point now, it had been, so 86, it had been going on 5 years since Martha had passed away. I hope none of you ever have to do this, and those of you who have had to go through this, my heart breaks for you. If you ever have someone that you believe is going to be the center of the picture of your entire life, taken from you early, and you have to start over again, I can recommend no better place to start over again than Paris. I was starting over again. I even thought I fell in love. Long story, very embarrassing, no time for it now. Point is, I was starting over and thought I was moving on again with life. I was going on I was in my mid-40s by this point. So I was still strong and had a future ahead of me. Thought I was starting over. Now, I said Martha was growing up to look like me. Mary, in my absence in Virginia, was growing up to be the spitting image of her mother and becoming a young lady by the time she was finally convinced to come and join us in France. And that's even more of a shock for a father to see that change happen in a young lady in his absence. Now to Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings, who was born in 1773, but 63, sorry. By this point, she was becoming a young lady, coming in 86. She was the half-sister of my wife, Martha. So my father-in-law, John Wales, after being a widower 3 times over, entered into a relationship with Sally Hemings' mother. Now, Sally Hemings' mother was the child of a first-generation African woman whose name was never recorded, brought from Africa, and a sea captain, British sea captain with the last name of Hemings. The family kept his name. They did not write why. They did not have to, but they kept it through the generations for reasons of their own. Perhaps you can talk to their descendants to learn more about that, but I never wrote about it either. But what this meant, so Sally or Sarah, and then her mother Elizabeth, and then the unnamed grandmother of Sally Hemings, was that Sally Hemings, by this point, was also very light-skinned and was growing up to very much bear a resemblance to her half-sister, my deceased wife Martha. and becoming a young lady by the time she arrived in Paris. So now, after thinking I was starting over from my wife having passed away, thinking I was moving on, to my surprise, into Paris stepped two ghosts of my deceased wife. Fodder for rumors indeed. Hear what the rumors stated, that sometime toward the end of my time in Paris, or shortly thereafter, Sally Hemings and I entered into a relationship that was to last to the end of my life. There weren't even rumors of anyone else. Depending on what pamphlets or screed you read, they say that we had between 1 and up to 5 and even up to 6 children together, all of whom I allowed freedom in different ways, some legally, some informally, some of whom moved to Chillicothe, Ohio. You can visit, even see a home in which Madison lived while he was in Ohio, if you want to travel to Chillicothe and learn more about those children of Sally Hemings and their travels west. But that goes beyond my time. Now, toward the end of my life, my family freed Sally Hemings, all of her children were freed. I mentioned earlier, I think much earlier today, I was in so much debt, I couldn't free the rest of my slaves. They were mortgaged to my creditors, but my family and I were able to free the children of Sally Hemings. I kept copies of thousands of letters. I tinkered with copying machines. I didn't really invent any. So if you've been told I invented copying machines, people want me to be Benjamin Franklin. I would have liked to have been Benjamin Franklin. I'm no inventor. But I copied thousands of letters, including my mistakes, my scratch-outs, because I want posterity to learn of my failures and successes and make their own judgments. But I burned all the letters between my wife and I, except a strip of poetry we shared from my favorite book, Tristram Shandy, when she was on her deathbed. I destroyed all the letters that my mother and I had shared in correspondence. Before she passed away, it was in 1776 in March. Just like Martha Washington destroyed all the correspondence between herself and George Washington. Because while I respect posterity, I do believe some things are none of posterity's business. For me to say anything other on this subject, or in any greater detail about Sally Hemings, I would have to be someone other than who I am. I would encourage you, though. I have on the table in the back, on a longer card than some of the others, each of the cards I have there have paintings of me, done the old-fashioned way. One is in a blue coat and has lists of books on it. One of the books is by a scholar who is a friend of my family at Monticello, who wrote about this subject in such great detail over the years. I don't talk about your day much, but this scholar is very important. Annette Gordon Reed is her name. Because of her writings on the subject, she received death threats because of what you intimated earlier about the freedom of speech. She supported her arguments with evidence of my own farm books, of the records I made, of when Sally Hemings was born, where her children were born, and when I was home. And none of her children were ever born when I hadn't been home 9 months earlier. Things like that. She wrote 2 books on it. One of them is in the list, on the book list of books I recommend. If you want more on the subject, turn to Annette Gordon Reed. And I mentioned descendants. My family at Monticello, I have learned, has been speaking over years now, to descendants of Sally Hemings and others who were enslaved at Monticello to get their stories that you can listen to, in some cases through your technology, to them actually telling their stories, which are no less viable than what I wrote down, because what if I left some facts out? What if I didn't want you to know everything? What if men in my day who were literate lied a little bit? What if politicians sometimes lie? I'm not saying they do. So you have resources to extend the story, but I can tell no more than I have.
Okay. So yeah, we have time for maybe
I'm here
one
with my
more.
daughter, but I'm just, I
Okay.
had to review my history, but I just wanted to know, during your time of, I guess, the writing of the Constitution, your ideals, did you help write the Constitution? Was it more so
I did not help to write the Constitution.
your
So I
ideals?
did write the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Declaration.
With the Constitution, I was in France starting rumors about myself.
France, that's right. Okay, well, thank you very much.
But the Declaration of Independence I did write. Some of the, I shared ideas that were incorporated in the Constitution, but the Constitution is not a philosophical document. It was a last-minute effort done in a rush to have a practical solution, and in some cases, compromises that were almost literal horse trading.
Yes, and just so you know, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence included a phrase that banned importation.
Well, it included a paragraph. My final rough draft contained a paragraph condemning slavery. But if you study it, you'll see. I didn't like that they cut the whole subject of slavery, because I thought it should be incorporated in the conversation of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
So they cut the whole subject was a problem, but the way I incorporated it was, I think, the word that caused both you and I and others of your era to become a bit twitchy. It was problematic. but this might actually work. I incorporated it in a list of what you would call war crimes committed by King George III in Parliament.
Correct.
In short, by freeing our slaves and then incorporating them in the British military to fight amongst us, he was committing that what you would call a war crime of causing them to murder us. It's a weak argument. I'm a lawyer, I have to admit. So it was removed partially because it wasn't exactly trying to free all the slaves, though it was condemning slavery as being immoral as well, but they threw out the baby with the bathwater by cutting the whole subject out.
Yeah. Okay. So
My good citizen, perhaps very quickly, you waited so long and patiently.
Hello, President. Mr. President, my question is, what was your main goal in your presidency?
What was my main goal in my presidency?
that's a good question.
I think I mentioned earlier, though I'm getting our two conversations a bit confused. My inauguration was the first transference of political power from one political party to another. And it was happening at the same time Napoleon was rising to power in Paris. When everyone in the world thought our revolution would do the same as every other revolution, which was do what Paris was doing, what France was doing, and go to despotism quickly, and mob rule and bloodshed, believing that punishing your political enemies through violence and threats and jailing was the legitimate way to do it, just like in first century Rome leading up to Julius Caesar as well. We managed through my long diatribe earlier to avoid that. In my first inaugural address, I articulate part of the idea that Professor Asili articulated earlier, but I'll mention something else I wrote in it that became, I believe, the test of my presidency, though there were other elements of my political philosophy that were certainly part of it. Smaller government, reduce the debt, things like that. I said that in our form of government, generally a democracy, under the three forms I mentioned, the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail. But for that rule to be rightful, it must be reasonable. And the minority possess their equal rights as well, which equal laws must protect. And to violate would be tyranny. That is a prelude to what Professor Asili quoted earlier from that inaugural address. My primary goal of my presidency was to show the world that it was possible for humans, for men, to rule themselves by reason and not by force.
Well, I just want to say, Mr. Jefferson, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for spending time to share your wisdom, answer questions from the audience. And, you know, there's a lot we can take from this conversation and share with others. And I think, number one, history is valuable. Learning history and seeing the value of it in our present day, and also being able to talk politics, religion, the two subjects that in America
are
the
anything at me. No one stormed out while I said that.
The two subjects we're told never to talk to others about, but maybe there's a way we can do that and be willing to listen. And as you said, as long as it's in good faith, how can it ever be wrong? So thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You did a great job.